Campaigning and elections decide the future of an entire country for the next 4 years. It is not a bidding ground for large corporations. We need to release democracy from the power of corporate firms, and we propose to ban corporate donations on political campaigns. Several ways we do this, right? Several things we ban in the first place. First, definitely corporations as a legal person from donating any amount of money or resources to a certain political candidate or party within their campaigning time. But then secondly, we think also people of importance representing the corporation, for example, the CEO of that corporation or a high-level manager of that particular corporation, donating money as a representation of this particular firm for this candidate or this political party within an election. So ultimately, thirdly, then we're also going to publicly announce that this abolition for the notice of all individuals through sources like news, like television, news, etc. Two arguments then in this speech. First, on minimizing corporate influence, and by corporate influence is especially harmful. And second, on increasing voter turnout and participation overall. First argument then on corporate influence. I'm going to quickly justify why corporations are not just satisfied with using this kind of donations for, say, their aspirations or what kind of candidate that they generally support, but instead to gain more leverage on top of the government, right? They have this inherent incentive to use the leverage they can get through an early stage of, for example, campaigning, because this gains them an extremely large amount of power throughout later years of this candidate sitting in office. We think that these corporations have a built-in incentive to use donations to shape things like policy and candidate strategy to make policies that are ultimately more beneficial towards their firm or the goings on in their firm. This is because when they fund these campaigns, they gain an increased amount of leverage over the government, especially when this government, where this candidate, say, is elected because of you. How your money actually funded the advertisements, for example, or the news broadcasts of this candidate that ultimately led to his or her election. This is when these corporations gain an incredible amount of leverage over the later stages of like this term or this election. Ultimately, they aren't necessarily satisfied with simply using donations for their aspirations. They want to use donations to fulfill this incentive to manipulate strategy and policy overall. This is extremely bad for two ways this happens. Firstly, funding through donations means that candidates will want to cater towards policies that are beneficial to these companies, because especially when companies have a lot of money at their discretion, there's generally a large competition for corporate funding in general, meaning that candidates will want to gain more money to, for example, like buy themselves headlines or advocate for things like their policies towards the majority of the public. They will view this kind of corporate funding as very important. Consequently, they will want to compete for corporate funding in between these different candidates and thus cater their policies towards these corporations of the corresponding interests of them to begin with, or else they will risk these corporations having no incentive and withdrawing their fund, ultimately reducing their power to campaign and advocate within this crucial campaigning period. But then secondly, this also allowing this funding gap to be able to open up also creates a lot of lobbying power towards the later stages of when this candidate sits in office or actually is elected as the president, right? Especially as I characterized you, when this party or when this particular candidate is elected because of the funding from this company, how the money from this company corporeally bought them headlines that ultimately led some more people knowing about them and voting for them. When this party or this candidate is elected because of the company, it gives the company much more negotiation power and leverage over the government to ultimately negotiate through means swaying government policies through things and activities like lobbying that ultimately we're going to prove to you are going to manipulate for their power and ultimately inflict harm upon society. So how exactly are they going to do this? We observed to you that the companies that are able to create mass amount of money and fund them into the corresponding campaigns of these politicians are probably not going to be, say, startups or SMEs or companies of, say, renewable energy that don't have so much development and markets, right? It's likely going to look like, for example, the oil companies that have a lot of congregated and accumulated wealth, being able to fund electric campaigns and lobby the government to later stages of influence to reduce environmental regulations on how much oil they produce and harm the environment. It probably looks like pharma companies with huge amounts of wealth and huge amounts of extraneous profit being able to lobby the government or sway these campaigns to reduce drug regulation, reduce trials and safety, to, for example, up the amount of time patents can last to product competition and increase the price of their drugs. It probably looks like companies in the mechanical production sector trying to lobby and influence the government policy so that there is a decreased checks on safety and check and balances for their company to push out for example, not that mature but profitable kind of product onto society. So I think ultimately what they're doing is that they're inflicting harm onto society overall by allowing this huge amount of negative corporate influence to begin with. Ultimately, we prevent corporations to gain this amount of leverage in campaigns before the candidates are even in office by completely banning this kind of inflow of donations to begin with, thus reducing things like their long-term lobbying power and minimizing this harm with a ban. Second argument then, on overall increasing participation and voter turnout. Corporate donations are going to be announced. It probably makes the headlines and news pretty clearly. For example, Tesla donating millions to this candidate in the same way that our bans are going to be announced on our side as we characterized in our framing and setup. We think this is what creates the perception difference towards these individuals in this country. For example, on opposition first, there's an extremely negative perception of this campaign process overall, right? Because government they will have this perception that the government is servicing these corporations and their interests and ideas instead of these individuals as actually citizens. We think this perception of things like puppetry of this particular candidate or of this particular candidate having $1 million corporation behind them pushing forward their applications and pushing forward their ideologies. We think this perception of this candidate not having a certain amount of self-actualization instead of being more of a political puppet for these corporations in general will ultimately mean that people are not likely inclined to have a good perception of this entire election in general. They're not likely to going to vote in such an active manner because they see election as a two-way choice between a candidate serving a company and another candidate also serving another company. I think the difference is on opposition. Without the need to cater towards these companies, the government's and the candidate's main audience is then the public. They are more likely to have to see how the strategy is more effective when they directly appeal and cater towards public interest and the masses. And ultimately, I think what this leads to is first designing better policies to cater towards public perception and to cater towards the public need. For example, welfare systems and investing into service sectors. But then secondly, I think when voters feel more respect and more ultimate emphasis coming from the government, how these governments value them as voters more than, for example, a multi-million company, they will also have a more positive perception and thus increase participation and voter turnout in this entire election. Ultimately, we enhance democracy on our proposition side. Very proud to propose.
First of all, I'll be rebutting some of side government's main claims. Secondly, I'll do some framing, and lastly, I have two pieces of substantive, right? So first of all, I think first speaker gave us two main questions. One main question. The thing that they tell us is that candidates will now cater policies that are especially beneficial for corporations. I think I have two main responses to this. The first is to say that this is not inherently harmful, right? I think corporations are major drivers of employment, innovation, and productivity, right? For example, when you do have tax cuts for corporations, they can help businesses expand. They can hire more workers and raise wages in the long term. I think policies created do have trickle down effect that can really benefit workers and the economy. I think secondly, it's important to note that corporations are especially big ones and wealthy ones are drivers of innovation. So when you do have corporate funding for innovation, it just leads to things that do benefit society and are good for industry progress, right? So I just thought that was not necessarily harmful. And I think the other claim that they give us about how this increases voter turnout and participation, I think I'll be responding to this later in my speech. When I do tell you, I think we flip this argument and tell you instead why we increase political literacy among citizens. So I think that in when we do ban so I think corporate funding look right now corporations can fund and make large political donations, and these donations are subject to disclosure, meaning that there is some degree of transparency there. What do we see now when we do ban these donations? I think we see that when you're unable to contribute directly, I think these corporations would need to rely on other forms of influence, such as lobbying and advocacy through non-profit organizations, or influencing policy through individual donations, right? I think secondly, there's an increased reliance on less transparent funding sources. I'll expand on this later and why this is extremely harmful. To substantive then, first of all, how is this bad for political landscape and essentially because it encourages like more non-transparent fundings. I think when like corporate donations are banned, I think corporations will likely still want to influence political outcomes simply because corporations they're just going to be like affected by like government policy, for example, like policies related to taxation, trade regulations, labor laws, etc. Right? I think they'll probably want to shape the competitive landscape and give themselves a market advantage. So therefore, I think it causes less regulated and and like less transparent funds, like for example through like dark money groups, right, who are not required to disclose their donors to the public. I think it encourages things like under the table gifts, right? They're probably more
I
likely to turn to I think to lobbying firms and consultants to influence policy without like making direct donations. I think these lobbying efforts are obviously less regulated. I think secondly, in the absence of corporate donations, like richer individuals are more likely to tell like other people, for example, like family, to donate in their place, right? For example, for their like own gains, such as to advance their interests or shape policy to align with their own like personal or business goals, right? Why do I think this is bad? I think two main reasons. Firstly, I think there's just this like there's just going to be an increased concentration of political power in the wealthy. Like wealthy individuals, they do contribute like large sums of money to political causes, and they gain disproportionate influence over like the political process. I think therefore democracy just like it's going to become more skewed because like policies like they favor the interests of like the ultra wealthy, a really small margin like group of people. I think like policy outcomes increasingly reflect only the wealthiest individuals. So this is like doesn't cater for like the majority. And I also think that when you have less transparent funding, it just means firstly there's going to be like the erosion of public trust in democracy, right? Because like the public just doesn't know where this money is coming from. And I think secondly, there's just going to be increased opportunities for corruption. Second piece of substantive then, I think about how this is like how does corporate donations like really increase political literacy among citizens? I think three pieces of categorization here. I think first of all, campaigns are going to be like really expensive, obviously. For example, like advertisements, rallies, like voter outreach and policy explanations, they all cost a lot of money. I think therefore corporate donations they provide like resources for these activities, allowing candidates to like really communicate their ideas more broadly and to a wider range of people. And I just like to say that this is a big impact on scale and likelihood. And I think lastly, unlike the like unlike individual like wealthy donors or unions, corporations have structured resources and incentives to fund broader campaign outreach, not just for specific like ideological causes. And I think therefore this makes like corporate donations a mechanism for broad public engagement rather than concentrated influence for narrow group, right? So a few mechanisms. I think first of all, because they're like funding campaign outreach, I think corporations they provide money that help campaigns run ads, public debates, town halls, educational content, and social media campaigns. I think these activities reach millions of citizens and like explaining like policy platforms, economic consequences, and election stakes. I think secondly, like it just provides more, like there's like structured and neutral funding, right? Because corporations they often aim to fund policy awareness and like economic stability because their interests just do lie in like broad predictable markets rather than like a single personal agenda. I think also like wealthy individuals or unions they typically fund candidates to like advance their own like narrow personal or ideological interests, right? Which may target only certain issues or demographics, not broad like civic education. I think thirdly, like it just amplifies political literacy because campaigns funded by like corporations can educate voters like at scale, improving understanding of how like policy trade-offs, party positions, and societal issues. I think this mechanism just leads to more informed voters and stronger democratic participation. I think one thing to note is that individuals or unions just cannot provide this unique benefit because firstly, wealthy individuals like the donations from these individuals are just like going to be focused more narrowly on personal gain, right? For example, like taxes, deregulation, contract. I think campaign outreach funded by billionaires may target only the issues that benefit them, not like broader public education. I think their contribution does not scale to public political literacy because their interest is just self-serving, right? And I think secondly, like when like unions do donations, I think union donations are often ideologically or like sector specific. Like they aim to benefit workers in a particular field, right? While like unions do mobilize their own members, they don't fund campaigns to reach the general public, which limits their impact on like overall political literacy, right? I have three main impacts for this. I think first of all, this just leads to like more informed like citizens because like citizens just understand policies and like election states better. I think this leads to like obviously more thoughtful voting decisions, and I think that was a benefit they didn't get. I think secondly, we have a stronger democracy because like we just have more educated voters, right? These voters are able to hold like these politicians accountable. It reduces corruption in the long run. And I think thirdly, they just get broader representation because corporate donations fund mass outreach, and they reach more like multiple societal groups benefit, and like not just the corporation itself, right? So I think like at the end of this, if we were to ban like corporate donations, it just meant there was probably going to be like less transparent funding, which meant that there was an increase of public distrust, and it also meant that like more wealthier individuals were prone to like like to probably like were prone to get other people to like donate, which meant that for their own interest. And I think that would just benefited like the broader public way less. I also think that it meant that you had less educated and less literate voters, because these ads just weren't like beneficial for them. So proud to oppose.
Firstly, let's address what opposition first speaker tells you at the start of their speech, telling you how, oh, actually having corporate influence isn't necessarily a bad thing because they're going to employ people and they're going to end up with more innovation. However, what do you think exactly corporate donations are in exchange for? What benefits the corporates themselves, right? Not their employees, not the overall society. What they're likely to be looking for is, for example, looser regulations so they can put out not yet fully tested products into the market and make profit from that, even if that might harm the consumers. What they're looking for is lower barriers to how much they can pay their workers so that they can make more profit and pay their workers less. What they're looking for is more like less regulation in general so that they can be able to make more profit on their side, not so that they can benefit the overall society. Because if that truly had benefit, the government would like agree to it anyways. Corporations wouldn't have to use donations to achieve that, right? So we think that when you think about it logically, what corporations are likely to use these donations for are probably not good things, probably for their own benefit and for like the profit of the richest of the rich. It is not going to be something that is actually beneficial to society. So we think that don't buy what they tell you on how actually having corporate influence would be a good thing, because we think that that's simply ridiculous. Secondly, what they tell you is that, oh, how corporate funding is actually to some degree transparent. We think not, right? Because in this case, corporate donations include both direct and indirect, which means that, yeah, it can be CEOs, and there is going to be to some degree like a lack of transparency, because you will only know which corporations donated, not what perhaps that donations were in exchange for or the reasons behind those donations. So we think that when corporations, they aren't exactly forced to actually, for example, take out their motives and display it to everyone, there's that same amount of lack of transparency, right? And then they tell you that, oh, corporations will still want to shape policies. So there are going to be things like underground donations and family. That is exactly what is being banned, because that includes indirect donations in our topic, right? We're banning both direct and indirect as contained in the info slide. So essentially, the CEO asking their family member to donate for them is still the same thing, because it's still going to be the corporation's money going to another person and then indirectly going back into the campaign. So that is what we're banning. So we think that just because corporations will try to find ways around the ban doesn't mean that we should ban it in the first place, because not banning it means that they don't even have to take that much effort. It means that it is extremely easy for them to influence the campaign without even having to hide their actions and without having an obligation to even be transparent and to like disclose what they are donating for, right? And the reason behind their donations. And okay, so that's why we think that in general, what they tell you about how, oh, corporations are going to try to find less transparent ways is untrue, because they already use those untransparent ways, and corporate donations in the first place never really had any transparency, and they don't prove that. Now moving on to, oh, how they tell you that there's going to be more how campaigns are going to not have money, so voters will not be as informed. We think that this is rather ridiculous, because you see one of their later impacts is that they tell you that, oh, when voters are more educated about campaigns and politics, then they're going to be able to hold the campaigns accountable. So why exactly would campaigns spend their hard-earned money on making voters educated so that those voters can hold themselves accountable and stop them from doing certain things? We do not see this kind of logical link. We think that's quite self-contradictory, that they think that campaigns would be so well-meaning as to educate voters instead of, for example, hosting galas and parties so that the richest of the rich can come and discuss with the person who is running for office on what kind of policies would benefit the rich people the most, such as tax rates, etc. And how like there would probably be, for example, funding for events where corporates could come here and talk about donations, as well as what would be exchanged for those donations, right? So we think that in general, when you look at campaigns that are trying to vie for the corporate's attention, when they know like the when they are able to greatly benefit from servicing these corporations, then what happens is that voters are stuck with a choice where they're probably looking at two different parties or two different candidates that are both essentially serving corporations' interests and not actually catering towards the general public. So we think that in general, even if somehow on their side, more people are going to get reached by the campaign, there's still going to be less voter turnout because people know that what is behind these campaigns is not like in favor of the public interest, but rather in favor of private interests of those big companies, of the richer people, and not actually the middle class, the working class, as well as the general public. So we think that even if somehow you take their best case and campaigns somehow decide to educate the voters, still voters are not going to feel respected. They're not going to feel like their vote is even important in the first place because they feel like the entire election process is being messed with and puppeted by larger powers that are beyond their control. So we think that in general, if you look at their impacts, like the minimal amount of possible voter education or gain that they're able to provide is largely outweighed by the fact that people are essentially going to see through, because there are going to be announcements for when corporates do donate, even if it's not for the reasons behind them, and people will feel like they're being misinformed, like something is being hidden from them. And also they tell you that, we think that it isn't really true that campaigns are not able to reach like normal people with a small amount of money, because in general they still do have things like social media. We think that having a much more large amount of money would only be for when they're trying to cater to the rich, when they have to host such big events, and not when they're trying simply to advertise what they themselves stand for, because posters and advertising on social media and actually serving the public is not that expensive. It is only when they are trying to service the rich and the greater interest, that is when they need those big corporate donations themselves, right? So we think that in general, what we are able to prove to you is that we're able to have less of a corporate influence, as well as things that could be very harmful, such as we have given you multiple examples, oil companies, pharmaceutical companies that with more money and more influence of the government would not bring good impacts to the society, but rather harm it with things like harming the environment by loosening environmental regulations, or harming the health of the population by loosening drug regulations. So we think that in general, what we have been able to prove to you on how corporate influence harms the society is much overweighing even the opposition's possible impact, if we are generous, of what they tell you on terms of innovation and employment, which we have proven has a very low likelihood. And so that is why I'm so proud to propose things.
The single thing that Team Proposition just doesn't understand in this debate is that when corporations have an easy way to donate money, that they will take it. When corporations' donations are seen, it becomes so much easier to track their donations. It makes it, and on Team Proposition's side, it makes it so much harder to check for corruption when people are donating and you don't have that paper traceable trail to be able to follow. So I have four main reasons as to why we thought that it was so much easier on our side, why it was so much more transparent, and why that transparency was specifically so important in this debate. First of all, we thought that in a legal situation, if it was legal on our side, that meant that corporations complied with rules. That meant that corporations typically complied with rules, complied with disclosure agreements. We had a few reasons as to why we thought corporations actually specifically wanted to follow these disclosure rules, and that was just corporations wanted to take the easy way out. We thought that politicians probably didn't want to receive dodgy donations as much as if they could have the option to receive a better donation that could be seen. We thought that political parties probably didn't want to take that much of a risk because they had a lot that they wanted to go for. But what do we see on Team Proposition side? We see that they use illegal methods, they use hidden methods, and we thought that was just so much worse because it was just people just couldn't find these methods. Two, we thought that media scrutiny only worked if there was information to see. We thought that in a world where it wasn't transparent, in a world where people couldn't see donations, we thought that the media just wouldn't be able to find these bad actors, that the media just wouldn't be able to find who was being corrupt, who was having bad donations. Because no, thank you. Because there just wasn't enough information to find and like release reports, such as like political reports, such as like independent reports, if there just wasn't this type of information. Three, before that, voters could only make an informed political decision if they had information. This was similar to the above reason, which was just that voters could only make a real informed and have like political literacy if they could see like the donations, if they could see who was being affected by this like the most. So we thought that was pretty good. And last of all, we thought that just meant that their assumption was just totally wrong. They claim that no donations equals no influence whatsoever. However, influence persists, but data disappears. The system becomes less transparent than before, not more. So we thought that was incredibly harmful. Now, before rebutting my two main pushes, I'll take your POI.
Why is it even important that you can track it if you can't hold them accountable because corporate donations are allowed in your world?
Yo, we thought that we could actually keep them accountable. On the outside, we have many like factors that could keep them accountable. One, we had voters that could see which parties were taking the most like corporate donations. Two, we could see that like the media could be able to see them and like media could scrutinize them, could like do reports and stuff. And three, we also had independent watchdogs that made their life so much easier to be able to just see this information. They wouldn't have to spend that time trying to see their donations. So that was why we thought that transparency was always better on our side. Okay, first on one of their pushes, which was just like they increased voter turnout and participation. So two things to say to this. First of all, it was just that before that people's perception wasn't necessarily driven by like some things that like the government might say, such as no donations by these corporations, but it was actually driven by policy outcome, not like the specific funding that governments got. Before that, when the public saw pro-corporation laws, when they saw that they had weak regulation, they formed their perception. They didn't necessarily form the perception from one signal where the government said, oh, we're not taking corporate funding anymore, because that wasn't necessarily very believable, because the government has like a history of taking these like bribes, and like so we thought that like the public just wasn't as dumb and wouldn't just like fall for that. Two, we actually flipped this. We thought that on your side, you actually removed visible accountabilities. We thought that companies didn't stop at anything to try influence governments, to try make money. But that means we have many examples of this. They lobby people, they bribe, they will always find a way. But on our side, the way is very transparent. It's very easy to see. And that's why we thought that we won. Okay. Second on this push about how they said that they minimize corporate influence. And this was like their main push. So I had three main things to say to this. First of all, if all that doesn't actually minimize their influence, it just changes form. We thought that they could get leverage for a variety of different methods, which I'll give you. They have leverage for like employment, they leverage for investments in the government. They still have a lot of leverage just in other forms. And they also have like lots of informal methods too, such as like having like fake corporations, such as getting other people to donate for them, and like having secret bribes that like you couldn't necessarily track because they were in person and stuff like that. Okay, second, we thought that this was just undemocratic because it still increased influence from other actors, such as celebrities, such as media owners, such as billionaires. They could still donate, they could still have the same amount of influence because they were just everyday people, and they could still have that. So we thought that there'd still be the same amount of harm being done because they could still lobby in the same way as corporations did. So we were so unclear as to why it was specifically so bad to like single out these corporations. And third, we thought that influence didn't necessarily equal control. We thought that this was still relatively minor because politicians still had to conform to their own party. They still had to conform to what their voters wanted. They still had to conform to watchdogs. They still had to conform to the media. So we were so unclear as to why that was happening. So we thought that like they didn't necessarily minimize corporate influence because it just happened in a variety of other ways. Okay, finally, I'd just like to do some of the comparative, which I really like explained. So what we see on our side, even on our worst case, we can still see who is donating. to these political organizations, it's still disclosed, and that meant that the media can check. That meant that everyday voters could check. That just meant that people were so much more informed about who was necessarily like trying to lobby with these governments. But what do we see on their side? We see that it's completely unregulated. It's so much more dangerous, and it's just so much harder to regulate. That just meant that it's like so much easier for these companies to give like this dark money to these political parties. It was so much easier. So we thought that corporate power in both worlds was symmetrical. But on our world, the thing that we won on was that media and the media and the public could just see all of this influence and what was happening. Thus, I'm so proud to oppose.
One strategic call out before I begin to my two clashes. Firstly, note that our opponents basically only have a lot of like mitigations in our arguments. For example, they try to argue things like going underground, or lobbying might be symmetrical because celebrities can also lobby, without actually combating our logic. Right now, move on to the first main clash in this debate about the culprit's incentive, and is this influence good or bad in the first place? We argue that it is really clearly that the culprit's incentive obviously do not align with the people. For example, it might be better for the workers that I get higher minimum wage, but then for the corporations, it's obviously more beneficial for them to lower the minimum wage, or to lower, for example, work condition regulations or things like that, in order to maximize profit. Right? This also looks like things like oil companies lobbying for looser regulations, or lobbying for more dominance in the market in general, and things like that. We argue it's really clear that because corporates try to maximize their profit and always try to like exploit their workers, obviously the regulations and policies that are going to influence in the government, it's not going to be really good policies. Whether it is drug patents trying to extending their, whether it is like big pharma trying to extend their monopolies, or oil companies trying to assert dominance, or like other like companies that's trying to lower minimum wages or make working environment regulations looser. It is obviously not going to be beneficial for the people in the first place, no matter what. With that in mind, now let's analyze the second clash now about transparency. Right, their main push is basically in this class, which is basically response to our whole case about how, which is basically their response to our whole case. It's basically, oh, we're gonna have love underground and shady business now instead of it being all like very transparent. Firstly, we have a few responses to this. Firstly, we argue it is very risky for the companies right now, like on our side, to go underground, because now it's illegal in the first place. Right, they will face like public dissatisfaction and legal consequences for breaking the law, quite literally. But also, secondly, we argue that there's likely going to be a lot of media scrutiny after the ban that's going to occur. For example, the media is obviously going to watch out for who is breaking the law and who is still making illegal donations and who's going underground and trying to influence the results of like the elections. Because we argue that this is likely going to be be a really attention-seeking topic that the media will be able to make a lot of money off of if they're actually able to find like catch a firm that's illegally donating or illegally trying to influence results. But also, thirdly, let's take the best case scenario on their side, right? On their side, donations are outright legal, right? Even if you find out that they're influencing like results or they're making donations, what are you exactly gonna do? You're not able to do anything. You're not able to legally prosecute them for the consequences. We don't really see how we don't really see the logic in this case. But also, fourthly, there's no regulations whatsoever on their side, right? Even if we concede to the best case scenario that now maybe donations will go underground and there will be like underground corruption and shady business, we argue that at best it is quite symmetrical, right? Because on their side, these big firms are still able to influence these government branches and how policies are made. At best, the amount of influence is likely going to be symmetrical. However, on our side, we're always going to have better democracy and less influence. No, thank you. PL's in the chat, please. You're always going to have less influence because less companies are obviously going to risk going underground and risk facing legal prosecution and risk like facing public dissatisfaction. So we're able to win this clash. By the end of these two clashes, I think Georgia can generally get an idea about how corporation donations or donations on behalf of corporations is very detrimental to a society, because now they get to dictate the policies that they have to get, and they get significant influence over campaigns that people are making. And we argue that their incentive is always going to be malicious in the perspective of the people. Now, move on to the third clash then about the democracy and moral literacy. What exactly was their main push out of this clash then? Their main push was basically this logic about how about more donations means more people are going to be aware of the campaigns, which means more informed voters. We have a few responses to this. Firstly, we argue that this probably isn't really a big impact in the first place because elections are very attention-seeking in the first place, right? People obviously care about the future of their countries and what policies they will be living under. So people in generally already care a lot about elections, right? We argue that people are aware in the first place, just if they want to vote for not. Having more awareness doesn't actually really change anything. Also, we argue that because elections are such like a high like attention-seeking topic, a lot of media companies during this time try to write stories about elections. They inform voters and they inform people simply because it is profit generating for them. Secondly, we are able to actually flip their case. What exactly does campaigns use money to do, right? They try to do things like smear other people or smear other candidates and spread propaganda about other candidates that will favor them in elections, that will make other candidates look wrong. For example, this candidate had done some illegal things or things like that. They won't do things like teach the voters how to have critical thinking skills or skills that are actually beneficial for democracy, right? I don't think like their incentive actually really aligns in the first place, which means that the population actually just get more confused, so they don't really want to vote in the first place. It is worse because on their side they're overshadowing the actually helpful and actual objective reporters. For example, like third party like news articles, for example, they're getting overshadowed, which means that voter literacy obviously will not increase on their side in the first place. What exactly was our push under this clash then? Our push is that individuals are actually more interested and more invested and more likely to want to participate in elections because they want to vote, because they believe that the government is actually serving them, not getting influenced by a lot of, for example, shady like corporation business and things like that. As I've already characterized before, this ban is likely going to attract a lot of media attention in the first place. So the public likely will know that now big corporations will not be able to have a say in things like my future policies that I will live in this country. So voters are more likely to be more invested and more likely to want to vote in this election in the first place because they believe that their opinions are actually able to get recognized in the first place. Therefore, we are also able to enhance democracy because of more informed voters and because of a higher voter turnout, which represents more of the population. So, Judge, what exactly are we able to prove in this debate? We are able to prove that, firstly, transparency doesn't really matter because on their side, even if they are more transparent, the illegal behavior on our side is just like outright legal right now and you can't prosecute them whatsoever. But also, secondly, they try to like argue this case about how corporate influence is actually good, which is known that contradicts with their idea about how, oh, this business is going to go underground, I'm going to go into the black market, I'm going to be really shady, because they're saying it's a good thing. Why exactly is going underground or going shady bad for them? Then this is like quite an interesting self-contradiction. But then we argue that corporate incentives are obviously going to be bad for the people, and this influence is going to like upright like defy basic democratic principles. Therefore, we are really proud to propose. Thank you.
Political campaigns do not like stop needing the money, right? I think objectively that is a fact. And I think they're just going to turn to like richer individuals or unions, as we told you at first, and as opposition ignored, like to get that money, right? And I'll be proving in this speech as rebuttal why that is comparatively inherently bad. Therefore, a few things in this speech. Firstly, how does this affect political campaigns? Secondly, how does this affect citizens? First, clash on why it harms, why it's like, how does it affect political campaigns, right? They told you a few things here. First thing, and their main push, was that like it decreases corporate influence in policies. A few things to say in response to this. Firstly, I'd just like to note that even if we concede that corporations seek influence in these policies, I think that is true in any system. But I'd just like to say that donations are not like the primary source of corporate power, right? I think corporations still exert influence through like firstly lobbying, secondly like roles of like advice, etc. Thirdly, like revolving door politics, etc. Right? Therefore, I think that matters because that just means that banning donations removes one of the only transparent forms of influence whilst leaving others intact. But I think the second response is just to say that even if you didn't believe that, I think they assume that banning donations removes leverage, right? I think in reality, it relocates it. I think influence moves to like private lobbying, like informal negotiations, and like non-public advocacy. I'll just like to note that these mechanisms are much harder to regulate and are invisible to voters, right? That is inherently helpful. But I'll just like to note that like the third response is just to say that like, even if we concede that some industries lobby for self-interest, I still think that like governments still face voter backlash. They still face like courts, right? They still face media scrutiny. Like donations do not guarantee policy control, etc., right? Therefore, I just think that was a few responses. But I think even if it did like somehow manage to like decrease corporate influence in policies, and we assume that campaigns just stop attempting to donate in its entirety, I think we're still able to win this like clash, because essentially, as I told you before, firstly, campaigns still need money, right? And scarcity causes harms, even if corporations like completely disappear from funding, and we assume that like completely, which is inherently untrue, right? But I still like to say that like campaigns still required like the things to like advertise, to like travel, to like staff further education. And now that money will come from wealthy individuals, will come from like incumbents, will come from like party elites, and it will come from state funding, right? I think that just means that's inherently harmful, because you're taking money from like inherently bad places, as I'll go on to explain in the second theme. But also I'll just like to note that just means that like policies becomes like less accessible, right? Therefore, why are we able to win even if that wasn't true? I think that like as I said before, with corporations gone, influence just concentrates on like wealthy private donors that aren't related to like the corporation in any way. I think that's still incredibly harmful. It goes to like political insiders, right? That is comparatively worse, because corporations are at least identifiable. They are reputationally constrained. They are subject to public backlash, right? But however, I'd just like to note that like comparatively, private individuals can still donate secretly through like proxies. They can face their scrutiny. They can push narrow ideology agendas, right? And that is really bad. I'd just like to note that like even at the end of that, even if you don't believe that, I still think that like we are still able to hold corporations accountable as like a bit of rebuilding, right? Therefore, I think a few things here then. Firstly, I think transparency still limits harm. Even if enforcement is perfect, I still think that like public visibility constrains behavior, right? Because firstly, corporations risk public backlash if their influence is exposed. Secondly, politicians are more careful when donations are public. And thirdly, media and watchdogs can still investigate and highlight abuse, right? Tracking isn't accountability itself, but like I think it's a prerequisite for any real accountability. No, this does not spread to like individuals or like unions, because I tell you as before that those things are like unique, right? Therefore, I think the second clash about how does this affect citizens? They tell you a few things here. First thing was that like it leads to more voter turnout. I think a few things here then. I think the public is probably like public discontent or like public mistrust or dissatisfaction with the government is simply not exclusive to outside, right? I think every time a political scandal occurs, whenever like the economy goes down, whenever a policy is pushed out that doesn't satisfy some extremists, there is bound to be a negative viewership of the government, right? That just means that secondly, when corporations are banned from donating, I think the public is only going to mistrust the government even more, as we told you at second, right? Because firstly, it's going to lead to a lot of speculation of whether the government is actually receiving these donations in secret or like it's not, right? Therefore, I think that's inherently harmful. Therefore, that just means that citizens become more cynical, not less, right? Because if people already believe that politicians are willing to bend rules, I think a ban just signals that they're hiding something, they're sweeping under the rug, they're still getting money, just not publicly, that this is performative and is not real reform. That just deepens mistrust, right? Because I just like to think that citizens think corruption has simply become less less transparent. That just means at the end of all of that, that voter turnout claim collapses. I think voter turnout increases when people feel hopeful, they feel that their vote matters, they think the system is fair. But I think that like if citizens comparatively think, and as I've proven, that firstly, donations are still happening in secret, secondly, that the government is presenting to be clean, right? And like thirdly, that corruption has just gone underground or to like other like individuals, like wealthy individuals that aren't related to like corrupt corporates, that like unions, then I just believe that this turnout falls because people disengage when they feel the system is dishonest, as both team has degrees. Therefore, I just think we're able to flip that point, right? Therefore, I just think that like at the end of that, what have we told you under this theme? I think we've told you a bit about like why it leads to like an increase in political literacy, right? But also like I'd just like to note that even if you didn't believe any of those previous rebuttals, I'd just like to say that like weighing our worst case versus their best case, I'll just like to note that affirmative's best case scenario is like corporation donations are like fully banned, corporations are like selflessly like educating voters at scale. I'll just like to note our worst case is that like their best case is essentially that like political campaigns still need money at the end of the day. Influence just shifts to like hidden lobbying, elites, and like special interests. Smaller parties and like challenges are weakened, like outreach becomes narrower. Our best case their worst case is still I think our worst case still outweighs their best case, because we're able to prove why our benefits are just far more likely, and we're able to go into the long term. Therefore, I think at the end of this speech, I've told you a few things. Firstly, why we win the clash about how it affects political campaigns. Secondly, why we win the clash about how it affects citizens. Therefore, so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Judge, at the end of this debate, I found two main clashes, and that was who gets better voter participation, and second, who gets better influence. First on who gets better voter participation then, what did we say? We said that we just increased general political literacy among citizens, and that was to say that corporate funding enabled more broader campaign outreach. What did they say to more outreach? They said that you don't need a lot of money for outreach, but we thought that you did actually need a lot of money for outreach. There are a few reasons to this. First of all, we thought that you needed meaningful nationwide political literacy campaigns. They required mass media, they required advertising, they required digital platforms, they required events, and they required large amounts of social media like popularity. We also thought that quality of information relied on resource and low budget outreach often resulted in simplistic or incomplete information, and that reduced effectiveness a lot. On our side, we were able to get more financial resources provided by corporations, allowing candidates to run larger and more visible campaigns. People are specifically exposed to more information about these candidates, policies, and political issues, which increases awareness, understanding, and engagement with the political process. Why did we think that these political parties would actually spend money on this outreach then? We thought that there were two main reasons. First of all, we thought voter support just depended on clarity. So these political parties needed voter support. They needed votes to win. We thought that voters responded clearly to clear messages about policies, goals, and values. And if the campaign was just confusing, if it was vague, then voters just wouldn't vote for you. And second, we thought that a competition just forced information to be shown. Where there are multiple parties, it meant that parties had to compete for attention, donations, and credibility. And under our world, these parties would have to make the best possible policies for the public in using this money from corporations to get votes. Okay, second. And we also thought that we got structured and neutral funding, and corporations often aimed to fund policy awareness and economic stability because their interest often lied in broad, predictable markets rather than a single personal agenda. Okay, second on the clash about who gets better influence. Let's just compare props and ops world. On proposition, they argue that because it's illegal, corporations will simply just stop donating to these political parties. They also neglect to respond to our arguments on how corporate influence changes forms, meaning at the end of the debate, we just symmetricize our case with theirs because both sides can still have corporate influence. Best case on their side, they get little to no donations, but they are impossible to track. So that even in the case that political parties get caught making pro-corporate laws and bad laws for society, they can't do anything as they won't be able to prove if the corporations donate money or not, and that's incredibly harmful. What happens on our side, we say that even in our worst case, with many political donations, we can still keep corporations and political parties accountable because we have free media, we have lots of public scrutiny, and that means that voters can make a real and informed decision. That means that on our side, we get better outcomes as voters are just able to make a better an informed choice that is good for their policy, and thus I was so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Opposition has said a lot of counterintuitive things in this debate, and I'm going to call them out one by one as I summarize the debate. First question then, because there are several questions we should probably answer. Who is actually able to keep the campaigns accountable? We think that it's very funny that they claim on their side that, oh, there's a lot of transparency and regulation on corporate donations, and then on our side, all of a sudden, corporates are going to be going underground, right? Because they're going to be banned. And then we think that on their side, if corporations want to have want to keep their own the reason behind their actions secret, they're probably still going to be going underground on their side. They never explain what type of regulation would be implemented in the first place, and never even justify the probability of their side regulating corporate donation at all, because that's not even in the topic. While on our side, we have the most effective form of regulation, which is called banning. And we think that if we assume that there's the same amount of regulative of power on both sides, it's much easier for the government to be able to regulate corporate donations and call out on our side, because firstly, it's actually illegal and they can actually have some sort of legal action onto campaigns that actually accept things like bribery and such donations. And also, on our side, it's much simpler because you simply don't allow any donations. While on their side, all you can essentially do is track their paper trail and then complain about it on the media while not actually being able to take any action to visibly remove that candidate or remove that party. So we think that on either way, we are the ones who are going to be able to have more regulation and more accountability. Furthermore, they say that, oh, all of these, the campaigns will just shift to private individuals and instead of corporations, right? We think that having both private individuals and corporations donating, they are not mutually exclusive. It's just that on our side, we're going to have less of a corporate interest, and the corporations are not going to be able to have a huge amount of leverage in the government that they would otherwise have on their side, along with private individuals, right? So we think that it's very funny that they think that it's, like that a campaign can't receive funding from both private individuals and corporations. And we think that either way, Judge, if you simply weigh the impacts on both sides, we are the side that is better able to keep corporations from having such easy ways into being able to hold leverage over the government and being able to easily lobby and have more successful lobbies because the government is incentivized to please them, because the government knows that they have to please them to be able to be re-elected again, right? So we think that in general, we are the ones who are able to keep more accountability. Furthermore, on media scrutiny, we think already having this ban on corporate donations brings media scrutiny to that thing and is able to make sure that that ban is enforced, as well as the fact that on their side, they're probably going to have less media scrutiny because the corporations are able to use their influence on the media, and because the candidates are able to use that much money that they now have an extra because they were donated to affect the media and to like cover over and overshadow neutral third parties that are actually reporting the truth. So we have much more accountability. And lastly, who actually gives more voter representation? We think that on our side, we are the ones who are able to give more representation because they have completely ignored the fact of our characterization that when corporations are able to donate to governments, no matter which candidate it is, all of them will be servicing those corporations, which means that no matter how clear-minded voters are, they will not have a choice because every person that they can vote for is going to have some sort of corporates that is helping them behind their back. There is going to be almost no choices for them that would actually represent the general public. That's the sort of world that exists on their side, and that's the sort of world we can prevent on our side. So no matter like what small amount of political literacy or how many people hear about the campaign on their side, that doesn't matter because every single person campaigning will still be working for a corporation. Thus, we are the ones that are actually able to keep accountability most straightforwardly, and we are the ones that are actually able to make sure that candidates actually want to service the general public. Thus, we are so proud to propose. Thank you.